Keferus, the cursor had been blinking for 47 minutes. Vial knew because the ship's chronometer was embedded in the lower right corner of every display on the threshold station, and because he had been staring at that blinking cursor for so long that the number had burned itself into his peripheral vision like a brand. 7 minutes. He had written 6 words in 47 minutes, and 3 of those words he deleted. The 3 that survived were, "They came at dawn." He had written that same sentence 14 times on 14 different documents in the last 3 weeks, and each time he had stopped after it, waiting for the story behind it to arrive, and each time it had not. Outside the narrow viewport to his left, the gas giant Thuun-Dara rotated in slow amber silence. Its storms were older than humanity's first fire. Marcus found he had no feelings about this at all. He was supposed to be writing the official Xeno-Contact Chronicle. The Galactic Compact required it. A full narrative account of the Scarab incursion, from first contact through ceasefire, submitted by the sole surviving threshold correspondent within 90 standard days of the conflict's end. 83 days had passed. 7 remained. Those days Marcus Vale, formerly of the Inner Worlds Press Syndicate, winner of the Meridian Prize for long-form testimony, author of 3 published accounts of previous border conflicts that his editor had called most viscerally honest war, writing in a generation, needed to produce approximately 6,000 words. He had 3. He pushed back from the terminal and looked at his hands. The left one shook slightly, a tremor that had arrived sometime in the 4th week, after Corridor 7 fell and had not left. He wasn't sure he wanted it to. It felt honest. The knock at his door was soft, which surprised him, because nothing about technician Yala Sen was soft. "You eating?" she said when he opened it. "I had something. That was yesterday's something." I checked the galley log. She looked past him at the glowing terminal, at the cursor still blinking. "Still blocked?" "I'm not blocked. I know what happened. I was there." "Then what is it?" He didn't answer. She came in anyway, which was Yala's way. She filled spaces that other people left open, not invasively, but with a kind of practical warmth that made rooms feel less like places where bad things had happened. She sat on the corner of his desk, looked at the 3 words on the screen, and said nothing for a moment. "My grandmother used to say that the hardest part of remembering a fire is that you have to go back inside it," she said finally. She survived the Kell Passage. She didn't write about it for 11 years. "I don't have 11 years. I have 7 days. Then you'd better go back inside." She left him a food container, and the door clicked shut behind her. Case. Marcus sat for another 20 minutes looking at the 3 words. Then he opened a new file and typed the date of first contact, and started. He did not stop for 16 hours. Scarab had arrived without announcement, which was itself the announcement. That was the first thing anyone needed to understand. Every prior xenocontact in recorded history had been preceded by some form of signal traffic, mathematical progressions, carrier waves, M-bursts, that human and allied analysts could spend years decoding while both sides stood at a careful distance and performed the ritual of mutual recognition. The Scarab sent nothing. They simply appeared at the outer edge of the Thuun-Dara system in a formation that covered a volume of space roughly the size of Earth's moon. And they did not transmit. And they did not respond to any of the 17 contact protocols dispatched toward them by Threshold Station's communications array. 6 days they sat there. The garrison commander, Admiral Priyanka Cho, had convened every senior staff briefing Marcus attended during those 6 days with the same 4 words. What do they want? No one had an answer. The Scarab ships, if ships was even the right word, because their forms suggested something grown rather than constructed, vast asymmetrical masses of dark biological material that absorbed light in ways the station's instruments struggled to quantify, simply waited. Their sensor profiles were unlike anything in the Compact's database. Their hulls registered heat emissions consistent with metabolism. 3 of the objects appeared to breathe. Marcus had written all of this down at the time, filling notebooks and audio logs with the obsessive documentation of a man who understood, somewhere below conscious thought, that he was witnessing something that would need to be witnessed precisely. He had crouched in briefing rooms with his recorder running, had stood at the wide observation windows of the station's upper ring, and watched those dark masses rotate against the star field, and had felt something that he could only describe inadequately as recognition. Not of the Scarab themselves. Nothing about them was familiar, but of the particular quality of the silence they occupied. He had felt it before, in the 10 minutes before a ceasefire broke down. In the held breath of a crowd that had just realized the man at the front had a weapon. The Scarab's silence was that kind of silence. It was not waiting. It was preparation. On the 7th day they moved. The assault lasted 9 hours, and Marcus wrote that part slowly, checking his notes 3 times against the audio logs, because he owed precision to everyone who had not survived it to read the account. The station's outer ring was breached in the first 40 minutes. Corridor 7, where the civilian research personnel were housed, fell at the 3-hour mark. Cho died at hour 6, at her post, with all available station power routed to the defensive grid in a configuration her chief engineer had told her was going to burn out every relay on decks 4 through 9, and had done exactly that after buying them 2 additional hours of partial shielding. Marcus had been in the secondary communications hub when it happened, transmitting compressed incident data to the compact relay buoy, 14 minutes out, and he had felt the lights die and the vibration change, and had understood without being told what it meant. What he wrote next, he wrote carefully. He wrote about Sergeant First Class Devlin Okafor, who was 31 years old, and had a photograph of his daughter taped to the inside of his helmet visor, a small girl named June, with her father's eyes, grinning at a camera on a beach somewhere warm. Okafor had sealed Corridor 12's emergency bulkheads by hand after the automated systems failed, which required standing in a section of corridor already partially exposed to vacuum and operating a manual crank that required 87 full rotations to complete. The atmospheric sensor Marcus' suit had registered the pressure in that corridor dropping the entire time. Okafor had finished all 87 rotations. He had then walked, not run, to the nearest pressure door, keyed it open, stepped through, and sealed it behind him. He had said, when Marcus found him leaning against the wall on the other side, "I hate that crank." Complained about that crank 3 times. He had then sat down on the deck and passed out from blood oxygen depletion. And Marcus had called for medical and stayed with him, and he had written all of this down in his notebook while kneeling on the deck beside an unconscious man, and the hand holding the pen had not shaken at all. He wrote about Private Thessaly Marsh, 19 years old, who had rigged a Scarev communications tendril, one of the thick biocable structures the attackers used to splice into station systems, to broadcast a narrow-band feedback signal on the Scarev's own carrier frequency. No one had known this was possible. Marsh had not known this was possible when she started. She had figured it out over the course of 40 minutes in a maintenance crawl space, using 3 tools from a standard repair kit and what she later described, with genuine puzzlement, as mostly guessing. The feedback had disrupted the Scarev's internal coordination across a localized section of the assault front for 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which the garrison had been able to consolidate and re-establish a defensible perimeter in the lower station. 11 minutes that, by the battle analyst's subsequent accounting, had preserved approximately 230 lives. Marcus had interviewed Marsh 3 weeks after the ceasefire, and she had spent most of the interview trying to explain that she didn't really understand why it had worked, and that she was worried about the accuracy of his account if he made it sound like she had known what she was doing, because she really, genuinely, had not. She had a way of talking about her own actions, with a kind of bemused detachment, as if she were describing something a stranger had done in her presence. Marcus had liked her enormously. He wrote about Chief Medical Officer Dr. Ren Takahashi, who had continued performing surgery for 6 hours after the medical bay lost primary power, working by the light of portable emergency lamps held by junior personnel who had pro-surgical training but who were told precisely where to point them, and did so without complaint. Takahashi's surgery log from those 6 hours contained 51 entries. 44 of those patients were alive when Marcus submitted his chronicle. Takahashi, when Marcus asked what she remembered most clearly about those hours, said, "The lamps kept drifting. You'd get halfway through a procedure, and the light would shift a centimeter, and you had to stop and correct without losing the thread. It was the most annoying thing I've ever dealt with. She had said this with the flat seriousness of someone who meant it exactly as stated and did not require it to be understood as anything more. Marcus wrote for 16 hours. And then he stopped, not because he was finished, but because his hands had stopped working properly, and his vision was doing something complicated at the edges. He stood up and walked to the viewport and looked at Thuun-Dara for a while, and the amber storms moved in their old, indifferent patterns. And he thought about what the story actually was. It was not a story about the Scarev, he understood now. He had spent 3 weeks thinking he couldn't write it because he didn't know enough about the Scarev. Their biology, their motives, their internal hierarchy, the meaning of their silence and their sudden violence, and then their equally sudden cessation of hostilities, withdrawing as abruptly as they had appeared after 31 hours of combat, and never, in the 8 months since, transmitting any explanation or acknowledgement. The Compact's xenobiologists were still working on it. The diplomats were still working on it. Marcus had been waiting for their conclusions as if the story could not be told without them, as if what had happened required the frame of alien motivation to make sense. The story was not about the Scarev. The story was about June grinning on a beach with her father's eyes. The story was about a 19-year-old in a crawl space who had not known what she was doing and had done it anyway. The story was about 44 people breathing because someone had kept correcting for a drifting lamp. He went back to the terminal and wrote until his next break, which came 9 hours later. The thing Marcus had not been able to say, in all the blocked weeks before he finally broke through, was not a fact or a sequence of events. It was something he had seen during the second hour of the assault, in a moment brief enough that it barely registered in his notes. 2 lines, written fast, almost illegible. He had come back to those 2 lines every day and stepped away from them because they were the center of it. And the center was what he couldn't face. He wrote it now. During the initial breach of the outer ring, when Scarev boarding parties had pushed through 3 access points simultaneously and the garrison's defense was fragmenting into independent unit actions across multiple decks, Marcus had been moving with a fire team toward the secondary communications hub. The fire team was led by a corporal named Aviela N., 26 years old, who moved through the corridors with an absolute economy of motion that Marcus found himself recording in his notebook even then, even in the middle of it. The way she checked corners with just her eyes and a slight lean of the shoulder. The way she communicated direction to her team with 2-finger gestures that they read without any visible process of interpretation. The team had come around a corner and encountered a Scarev boarding unit at close range, and Marcus had pressed himself against the wall and watched what happened next. What happened next was this. Chen's team was 3 people, and the Scarev unit facing them was 7 entities, each 2 meters tall and structured in ways that made the word entity feel more accurate than soldier. Their limbs articulated at angles that didn't match any skeletal logic Marcus could identify. Their surfaces absorbing the corridor lights, the overall effect of them in a confined space being, specifically, that they seemed to take up more visual space than their physical dimensions should allow, as if the eye kept expecting to find edges that weren't there. Chen's team had a fraction of a second of reaction time. Chen raised her weapon. Two team members raised their weapons. And then, before any trigger was pulled on either side, a Scarev in the center of the formation made a sound. A low, resonant click that Marcus felt more than heard, and the entire formation stopped. They looked at the 3 humans. One of the things that had emerged from the Compact's post-conflict xenobiological analysis was that the Scarev possessed extremely sophisticated sensory apparatus. That they perceived electromagnetic activity, thermal output, and chemical signaling at ranges and resolutions that made their understanding of a given environment far more detailed than human senses could achieve. They knew, the analyst had concluded, a great deal about any organism they were near. They read the biological state of a situation in ways that humans could not. What Marcus had seen, in that fraction of a second, in that corridor, was the Scarev looking at Aviela, Chen, and her 2 people, and then the Scarev stopping. Chen's team did not stop. They held their positions and their weapons and their nerve, and they waited, and they did not move, and they did not show what was happening behind their eyes, which Marcus could not see from his angle, and which was probably just as well. And the Scarab looked at them for what the chronometer later confirmed was 4 seconds. 4 seconds, in the middle of a 9-hour assault. And then the formation moved, and it moved around them, pressing past in the narrow corridor with a closeness that Marcus could still feel in his chest when he thought about it, and continued in the direction it had been going. Chen's team pressed against the wall and let them pass. When the Scarev were around the corner and the corridor was quiet, one of Chen's team members, the young one, whose name Marcus had not had the presence of mind to get, and had never subsequently been able to identify from the unit rosters, let out a breath. Just a breath, long and slow and controlled. Chen lowered her weapon, checked the corridor behind them, and said, very quietly, "Keep moving." That was it. That was the thing Marcus had not been able to write for 3 weeks. He wrote it now, and he wrote around it, and he wrote what it meant. Which was not that the Scarev were merciful, because the 9 hours of evidence argued comprehensively against that reading. And not that Chen's team had done something extraordinary, because they were doing what every person on that station was doing in their own corridor, their own deck, their own moment of choice. What it meant was something the xenobiologists had touched on obliquely in their preliminary report, in a passage that was careful and hedged in the language of scientific uncertainty, but which Marcus translated, in his own notes, as, the Scarev had found something they didn't have a category for. They were good at reading biological states. They were not good at reading a biological state that was simultaneously absolutely terrified and absolutely not stopping. This was not a capability they appeared to have encountered before. Marcus wrote about this for a long time. He wrote about how it was not bravery in the sense of an absence of fear. All of the people he had spoken to in the weeks after the ceasefire had been clear about being afraid, had described the specific texture of their fear with the same casual honesty that Yala Sensa deployed about everything, as if the fear were simply data to be reported accurately. None of them had been not afraid. They had all been afraid and continued anyway, which was, as far as Marcus could tell from 37 years of watching people in difficult circumstances, the most specifically human thing there was. He wrote about the compact xenologist's growing theory that the Scarev operated on a biological decision matrix that weighted costs against expected outcomes, and that this matrix had, over some lengthy evolutionary history, never needed to account for organisms that continued past the point of rational self-preservation. The Scarev were not cowardly. They were, by any functional definition, ferociously effective fighters. But they were also, in some deep sense, that the analysts were still working to articulate, calculating. Every action in their assault had been precise and purposeful. They had moved through the station with the efficiency of a system optimizing toward a clear outcome. And then they had looked at Aviela Chen's fire team in a corridor, and the calculation had apparently returned something their matrix could not resolve, and they had gone around. This had happened. The garrison's battle analysts had found, in 7 documented incidents during the assault. In every case, small human units had held position against numerically superior Scarev forces, and in every case the Scarev had eventually disengaged and moved past. The analysts had initially coded these as tactical retreats, as the Scarev redirecting toward objectives of greater priority. The more Marcus thought about it, the less certain he was that this was the right explanation. He thought the Scarev had encountered something they genuinely did not know what to do with, and that this was not a limitation in their combat capability. It was a limitation in their model of what combat participants were capable of. They had not, apparently, fought humans before. Marcus wrote this section very slowly, because it was the section that mattered most. The section that would either make the chronicle something worth reading or reduce it to another incident report. He wrote about the gap between what a species could observe about another and what it could actually understand. He wrote about Oakfor and his 87 rotations and the complaint about the crank. He wrote about Marsh in the crawlspace, working from a position of acknowledged ignorance toward a solution that shouldn't have existed. He wrote about Takahashi correcting for a drifting lamp 51 times. He wrote about what it cost. Because it had cost. The ceasefire had not come cheaply. The station's casualty list ran to 119 names. And Marcus had spent a week with that list before he could write about it, had gone through each entry with the same careful attention he brought to everything, looking for the specific person in each number, finding them sometimes in the unit citations and the survivor accounts and the fragments of their voices caught on audio logs, and sometimes not finding them, and sitting with the not finding in a way that the tremor in his left hand was part of. He wrote about Lieutenant Commander Fidelis Mora, who had sealed a hull breach from outside the station in a suit not rated for the exposure duration, done so because the only other option was to let the breach expand to a size that would compromise the medical bay, and who had made this choice in approximately 4 seconds and described it afterward in a voice that had the carefully neutral quality of someone determined not to make a scene as the obvious call. Mora had survived with nerve damage to both hands that the medical staff believed was permanent. When Marcus had interviewed him, he had kept opening and closing his right hand slowly during the conversation, looking at it with an expression of focused, private attention, like a man trying to remember a word in another language. He wrote about all of it, and when he was finished the word count was 6,412, and the 7 days had become 9 hours, and the cursor was no longer blinking because there was no longer any empty space after it, and the amber storms of Thuun-Dara moved outside the viewport, in the darkness of a night that had turned to day without Marcus noticing. He leaned back in his chair and read it through once. Then he sent it to his editor. The response came 3 hours later, which was fast. Fast enough that Marcus understood she had read it in one sitting without stopping. "This is the one," she wrote. "This is the one you were supposed to write. Change anything." He sat with that for a while. Then he went to the galley, where Yala Sene was eating something that smelled like actual food, and he sat across from her, and she looked at him once. That specific, economical look, that was how she asked questions, and he said, "Done." She nodded. She passed him the other food container. He ate. Outside the station's wide observations windows, at the outer edge of the system, the dark masses of the Skarev formation were still there. They had not left. They had not moved. They had simply remained, since the ceasefire, at the edge of sensor range, which the analysts described as either a diplomatic gesture or a territorial marker, or something else entirely, that no current framework adequately explained. Marcus looked at them while he ate. He thought about the xenobiological report's cautious conclusion that the Skarev would almost certainly return. That this had been, by every available indicator, a probe rather than an invasion. A survey of what they were dealing with, conducted in the most direct manner their decision matrix allowed. That whatever they had learned from it, they were still learning. Out there in the dark at the edge of the system, running their calculations. He thought about Avila Chen in the corridor. The Scarab's mistake, if mistake was a word that applied to something this fundamental, had been the same mistake most species made when they first encountered humans. They had measured the biological signals correctly. The elevated heart rates, the adrenaline surge, the microtremors of muscle groups responding to threat stimulus. They had read all of this as Marcus's left hand had read it, as evidence of the thing the fear was. They had not yet understood that humans had, over the full length of their history, developed a specific and peculiar relationship with that feeling. Not overcoming it, not suppressing it, but carrying it. Walking forward with it in their chest like a carried weight, because the alternative was staying still, and humans were not constitutionally good at staying still. He thought about June on her beach, grinning into a camera, in the light of some warm afternoon, with no idea yet what her father's hands knew how to do. He thought about 19 years old, in a crawl space, and mostly guessing. He thought about the drifting lamp and the correction. 87 rotations. He finished eating. He put the container in the recycler. He looked out at the amber storms and the dark shapes at the system's edge for a while longer. Then he opened a new document and typed the date and started another one. The cursor stopped blinking. Out in the black, at the edge of what they understood, the Scarab ran their calculations, and the numbers kept not resolving. and the storms of Thuun-Dara turned in their ancient amber dark, older than fear, older than stubbornness, older than the long human habit of going back inside the fire to find out what happened next. They had not, the analyst noted in the latest update, moved, neither had we.